And we wanted to do something different with this debate. Rather than a typical debate where each candidate is given a set amount of time to answer our set questions, we really wanted this to be more of a conversation with the candidates to hopefully in the end benefit you, the viewers.
And Catherine, before we get started, let us set the political scene in California's 52nd Congressional District to give you a good idea why the race has nationwide importance. NBC 7's Artie Ojeda explains.
The 52nd Congressional District stretches from Coronado up the coast to La Jolla, inland to Scripps Ranch, Poway, and up to Rancho Bernardo. Registered voters in the district are split. 34% Republican, 32% Democrat, 29% Independent.
Most races in Congress are very highly partisan. They're very highly split between either Republican or Democrat. This is one of the few non-safe seats in the country.
Which is why this race matters. San Diego voters could potentially give the GOP another seat in the Republican-controlled House. So what messages do candidates Scott Peters and Carl DeMaio need to convey?
Peters has to convince the middle that DeMaio is not one of them, and he is. So convince the middle that DeMaio is too extreme, which is why you hear Tea Party coming out of Peters' mouth every time he can with respect to DeMaio. And sort of hold on and hope that the Republican surge that we're probably going to see nationwide is not going to extend to San Diego.
Voters are familiar with the candidates, both former city councilmen. Both generally agree on most social issues like the environment, same-sex marriage. Both are pro-choice. Up to now, the candidates have focused on local themes familiar in San Diego. DeMaio has hammered Peters over San Diego's pension issue, taking credit for his role in pension reform.
The challenge for the DeMaio campaign has been how to try and take that track record and those experiences that Carl had at the local level, translate them into a national race.
But what about those issues they'll tackle in Congress? Immigration reform, homeland security, defense spending.
DeMaio is not particularly interested in talking about national security. He's not particularly interested in talking about foreign policy. DeMaio wants to focus the race on business issues and budget issues, and that's where he thinks he can make inroads.
But recently, the National Chamber of Commerce endorsed Peters, setting off a nasty reaction from the DeMaio camp, ending with this ugly tweet from the chamber. DeMaio campaign imploding. It could all come down to voter turnout during an off-year election, and Eric Bruvald says that includes a critical block of several thousand student voters at UCSD.
We think of student debt, we think of post-graduation job prospects, we think of, what the economy is going to look like for us, 5-10 years down the line.
Okay, so with all of that in mind, and our colleague Artie certainly brought up a lot of issues that we'll touch on here, we really wanted to start with what is the big story of the day, and it's certainly an issue that Congress is going to be dealing with for some time. The U.S. began airstrikes against ISIS targets in Syria last night. This action has pretty much received bipartisan support. What I'm curious about, though, is this issue of ground troops, because a lot of military experts have said that without adequate ground troop support on the ground, we're not going to be able to bring an end to ISIS. And they just don't think that some of the local troops, the Kurds, the Iraqi security forces, are up to the job. So my question to both of you is, at what point, if ever, would you support U.S. ground troops in Iraq or Syria to fight ISIS? And we'll begin with you, Mr. DeMaio.
Well, San Diego is a military town, so national security issues are indeed important to all San Diegans. If you're going to ask a service member to leave their spouse, to leave their children, to put their lives on the line, you best satisfy two key tests. First, make sure that it's a national security crisis or an issue that is of direct impact to the American national security positions. I think in the case of ISIS, that clearly has been established. This is a terrorist group. It has already killed several Americans, and it continues to threaten Americans. If not checked, we will see this continue to spiral out of control. But the second test is equally important, and that is that we have a thoughtful, common sense strategy to win. When we intervene, we should have a strategy to actually successfully win, immobilize our enemy. In this case, I don't believe that the president has laid out an adequate strategy. I've talked to some of my own military advisors. These are flag officers, generals, admirals, who are advising me, service members who are currently serving or veterans, and they all have expressed concerns that the president seems to be playing more of a political game of talking about just airstrikes and a little bit of technical advice on the ground. Well, I think that we're going to find in the next several weeks that that's probably going to be inadequate. And if we have to build a case for an expansion, that has to be something that the American people will support. And that's where the administration and Congress should not treat this as a Democrat issue or a Republican issue. this would be an American issue, and we need more members of Congress who approach it that way.
So at this point, it sounds to me like you think not enough information for ground troops, U.S. ground troops. Mr. Peters, what about you? How do you feel about the case that the president has laid out to this point, and when would you support U.S. ground troops in these regions?
Well, as a Congress member, my important job is to keep you and your family safe from harm. And we know that around the world, not just in the Middle East, there are people in dark rooms and even caves planning to hurt our country, our families, and we have to go to those places and stop them. ISIS is a tremendously dangerous force. These new terrorists are even much better equipped, much better funded, much more tactical than Al-Qaeda, which attacked us in 2001. And so we have to take this very, very seriously. I support the plan that Congress, the President, and our commanders, most important, agreed to, which is going to build a multi-strategy plan for dealing with ISIS. Part of it is these airstrikes, which will degrade the enemy, but there's a much bigger plan too. Part of it is developing a political system in Iraq that everyone can rely on, that's going to provide some stability so that these people will be motivated and equipped to fight for themselves. Part of it is what we saw yesterday, which is allies in the area, people who are also interested in their security. They have to be part of the fight as well. Part of it is getting international support. We know that France has indicated that they're interested because they know that before terrorism gets to the United States, it's going to hit Europe first. They're concerned. And part of it is the equipment and training of some Syrians who will be carefully vetted on the ground.
Both of you all are expressing a good measure of support for going in and trying to eradicate ISIS. I think for a lot of your would-be constituents, where's the line in the sand for both of you? How far, at what point would you say, I'm no longer going to support an effort? Where's the line in the sand?
Well, I think that gets to the two criteria that I laid out, and they're actually not my criteria. They were actually articulated first by former Defense Secretary Cap Weinberger, who served in the Reagan administration. He said that if you're going to put men and women in our armed services in harm's way, that we have to satisfy first that the issue is a direct national security threat to our country, and second, that we have to have a well thought out plan. I believe that we've gotten into conflicts around the globe where the first criteria has not been adhered to, where we've allowed mission creep. We've gotten into nation building, policing other countries, imposing governments, running public health systems in certain cases, roles that we should not be in that don't really relate to our national security interests. They may be humanitarian, but they are not a direct link to our national security interests. And I think a lot of Americans are upset by the mission creep we saw in Afghanistan and in Iraq. Second, we have to ensure that when we do use force, that it's part of a sensible, strategic approach to winning. And that should not be a Democrat or Republican issue. That should be something where Congress asks tough questions and isn't afraid to challenge perhaps their own party when they're not getting those sorts of answers, because you're asking men and women to leave their families and put their lives on the line. And they need to know that it's not only an important issue that they should be involved in that relates to our national security, but we have supported them by giving them the right sort of intervention and approach to winning the battle.
Thank you. Congressman, at what point would you say no? Would you stop supporting?
We've really seen the limitations of our ability to affect Afghanistan and Iraq with ground troops. And so I think we've got to resist that. At this point, I don't think the case has been made to put ground troops in, and frankly, no one's proposing it. So as a member of the Armed Services Committee, we listen very hard to the briefings about what our ability is to influence this and what our real interest is directly as a nation for our own security, for our own families.
Do you believe that ISIS can be defeated without ground troops, without U.S. ground troops?
I think they can be degraded in the strategy that we're following, but I would say too that it doesn't have to be American ground troops. And one of the advantages of the strategy that we've tried to employ is we like the people in the area to be fighting for their own freedom. Iraqis, Kurds, Syrians, who we would like to equip and train.
I think the problem, though, is that people are saying that those forces are not going to be able to accomplish it on the ground, and that is maybe the concern among the American people, that we are being told something that then down the line is not going to be what was pitched.
We share that concern, too, and I think, you can't guarantee that this is going to be successful, but I have a lot of faith in our military commanders in the strategy that they laid out. Now, they may come back and ask for more, but the one thing we insisted on in Congress is that any further authorizations would have to come back in Congress. And one thing I would say, too, is I've been critical of the President for not being as close a partner with Congress as he could be In this case, we've worked very closely with the President and with our commanders to figure out what the best strategy is at this point in time.
Well, can I follow up with this? And this may be a very early hypothetical, but let's just say best case scenario, the airstrikes are successful, or whatever surges may come afterwards, and ISIS is reduced, let's say, to a, quote, manageable problem, maybe even eliminated. What moves then should the Allies make in order to fill what could be a power vacuum that is going to attract other terrorist groups that rise up? The Taliban morphs into Al-Qaeda, and then now we've got ISIS. What might be next?
Once again, Gene, one of the main problems we've had is we had a Iraqi government that wasn't politically sufficient to carry the weight of bringing peace to the region. The Maliki government was only concerned with one sect. It didn't include the Kurds, didn't include the Sunnis, and we have to have an inclusive government that reaches across those sectarian lines. That's been our first priority. We've seen a change in the government. We've seen some promising signs that the next government will be more inclusive. We can't be the government of Iraq. We just can't be it. We have to use diplomacy, and we have to ally with other countries in the region to create a political system that's more sustainable.
Your take, Mr. DeMaio.
Look, again, this is, I think, a situation where politicians from both sides of the aisle are trying to sugarcoat it. I think that we have to have a more focused view on our national security interests, and we have to have a more limited use of force that reflects our national interests. Clearly defined missions are important, and my concern here is that the mission is not clearly defined. And as Catherine pointed out, I think that the concern that most San Diegans have and many Americans have is that we wake up one day and find that what was sold to us by the politicians is not actually the case, and that we've seen mission creep. We saw that in Afghanistan, we saw that in Iraq, and members of Congress need to be willing to take on their own party, their own administration, to make sure that we have clarity and limitations and focus on whenever we're putting people's lives on the line in the U.S. military.
Moving on to issues which still are international in scope, but it's a big domestic issue. You are a member of Congress right now. I have heard it said that immigration reform is a lot like the weather. Everybody talks about it, but nobody does anything about it. Do you have any specific policy ideas, initiatives that would break the gridlock here?
It's not the case, Gene, in this case. The Senate last summer voted with 69 votes on a bipartisan immigration bill. It's a compromise. It's not perfect. I don't love everything in it. But I would like to see the Speaker put that compromise on the House floor. It would pass. It would have tremendous economic benefits for economic growth, 5.4% over the next 20 years, almost $1 trillion in deficit reduction, help stabilize Social Security, increase border security, allow in the workers to earn a path to citizenship by paying a fine, paying their taxes, but allow the workers we need in the tech sector. If you talk to Qualcomm, this is very important to them. In biotechnology, we're sending people home who we educate to cure diseases and start jobs in other countries instead of keeping them here. Right down to farm workers who we don't have enough farm workers. We're letting some crops rot in the field. My opponent says he wouldn't vote for that, but it's right before us. We could do it tomorrow.
So what's the problem with what you're hearing?
What the problem is, this is why Washington is broken, is that you get all these special interests who load up this big bill, thousands of pages long, and we crowd out the issues that people actually agree on. Here's an issue that I think everybody agrees on. We need to secure the border. We need to secure the border first. We need to put the resources and the attention and the accountability behind securing our nation's border, not only so that we can prevent an immigration system where people get to run to the front of the line, but also for national security issues. Who knows who's able to cross into our border in terms of terrorist groups that may want to harm the American people. So border security is a critical prerequisite. But instead of focusing on something that Democrats, Republicans, and independents, and look at the polling nationally and here in San Diego, Latinos support a secure border, Democrats support a secure border, independents and Republicans, but members of Congress constantly want to put poison pills in these bills that become thousands of pages long. And then they sit there and they point fingers at each other. I think we ought to focus on issues where we see great unity in this country. Securing the border first should be a single subject bill, and I think that it would get bipartisan support if we focused on those areas of agreement.
Really, this is the magic of Mr. DeMaio trying to confuse the issue. There's no disagreement in the Senate. We had a bipartisan approach. Part of it is securing the border, by the way. They want to build a fence all the way across the border. They want to virtually double the size of the Border Patrol. And Republicans and Democrats agreed on this compromise. We can't get a vote because the Speaker of the House, Mr. Boehner, who's supporting Mr. DeMaio, won't even put it up for a vote. And listen, this is something on which everyone agrees. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the labor community, the farmers and the farm workers, the faith community and the tech community all agree. And we also know that business analysts, the Harvard Business School, says that this is one of the most important things we could do to get job creation going, get the economy moving. And how important would that be to San Diego? All we need is the Speaker to put this before the House, and we would have immigration reform the next day.
Well, color me surprised, Scott Peters, because you had an opportunity when the bill came before the House, a very targeted bill on border security, funding for border security, and much of that money would have ended up here in San Diego to deal with some of our challenges, and you voted no on a scaled back version. So when you sit there and say, well, if we could just have a vote, Scott, when you had a chance to actually be part of a solution, to actually be part of a modest step forward to provide the resources necessary to secure our border, you voted no. And you know what? You bent to your own party's pressure. Nancy Pelosi and the Democrat leadership twisted arms to say, we want to make sure that no Democrat votes are part of this compromise package. You voted no. That bill actually did go to the House floor.
I voted no because border security isn't the only element of immigration reform that we need. What we need to deal with these labor supply issues.
Well, let's talk about that.
I would just like to say one thing about Mrs. Pelosi. I think that the councilman knows that I was rated last year the 4th most independent Democrat because I'm willing to take votes against my party. And I do rank my country first, my district second, and my party third. I would not have gotten that ranking if I was voting lockstep with my party. That's also the reason I got the endorsement of the United States Chamber of Commerce. Out of 250 candidates that they endorsed, 5 were Democrats. And what they're concerned about is they want Democrats that they can work with to solve problems. They've seen that as my history. What they don't want is Tea Party extremists, who are the kind of people who shut the government down and threaten our nation's credit rating. They see Mr. DeMaio as part of that camp.
Wait, Scott. Let's just stop right here. You want to continue to apply labels to me because you can't defend your own record. So you can call me names all you want. All right, I haven't sat there and called you names. I have issues that I disagree with you on, and there are differences in our records in the way in which we've approached issues. But to sit there and say, I'm just going to call my opponent a Tea Party right-wing nutjob extremist, Scott, it's dishonest, it's divisive, and it's what's wrong with politics today. And let's talk about
Can we talk about the Tea Party thing first? Because obviously we knew this was going to come up. We've seen it in a lot of commercials on television, and it's certainly a label that your opponent is trying to have stick.
Non-stop. You can't turn on the TV without seeing the ads.
But here's the thing. Now let's bring up the quote that has been attributed to you, where you basically said you would owe to the Tea Party. Explain to me.
Actually, no. And Catherine, this is important.
This is what I want you to clear up.
Scott Peters actually took a video and he spliced it. I gave a speech across San Diego to many groups, including labor unions who, of course, politically don't support me. They are on the far left. There's not a whole lot we have in common. But I stood before any group that could listen to our plan on pension reform. In this speech, I was not talking about social issues, because I disagree with the Tea Party on their right-wing approach to social issues. I don't think social issues should be part of our focus in Washington. I stood before them and I said, let's focus on a positive agenda. And what can we do positive in San Diego? We can reform the out-of-control pension system at City Hall. We can replace those fat cat pensions that the politicians have voted themselves, including Mr. Peters, and put in place a system that's not only sustainable, that allows us to save money and restore services. I implored them, just like I implored the labor unions, to come to the table and be part of the solution to move San Diego forward. I will continue to reach out to groups, Catherine, that disagree with me.
Here's the thing, though. Here's what I think the issue is.
I will continue to reach out to groups that disagree with me.
The quote that's attributed to you is, I will owe you and our collective movement everything. And this is what they're saying is you are then going to be beholden to the Tea Party.
And did you see the question that Mr. Peters spliced out? The question was, who's backing your opponents? And I said, well, look, in the mayor's race, the downtown insiders and the government unions, I'm not their candidate. And I'm proud of that, because who do I owe? I owe you, the people. I owe you, the people, everything. And that is exactly how I've always approached every issue. For Mr. Peters to try to deceive voters is just an example of desperation because he can't defend his own record of putting the city of San Diego on the brink of bankruptcy.
Let's let him talk about these issues that have come up.
First of all, I'm more than happy to defend my record, and I'm proud of my record in Congress and at the city.
Was that taken out of context, though?
But how do you take this out of context, Gene? First of all, the whole video is on my website. But the quote is, the Tea Party is the conscience of the accountable government movement. If I win, I will owe you and our collective movement and everything. Later in the video, you see Mr. DeMaio sneer at people who would sit down around the table and work out solutions. So let me just tell you, that's one thing. It's his own words. The second is his supporters. There were 3 Republicans in the primary running in this race. The Tea Party, every Tea Party member, every Tea Party PAC chose Mr. DeMaio as their candidate because they know that when he gets there, he can join up with them.
That's absolutely
not true.
That's absolutely not
Third is his own record at the city, where 102 times he was the one no vote on the city council. He voted against all 4 of Mayor Sanders and the council's bipartisan budgets because they weren't extreme enough. He voted against the $700 million health care reform that they worked out at the table with the labor unions. When he lost the mayor's race to Bob Filner, the UT, which was a great supporter of his, editorialized the next morning he would leave a legacy of divisiveness. And when he wanted to be mayor after Mr. Filner resigned at my urging under the circumstances, they had a big meeting of the Republican leadership in La Jolla, and the upshot was they said, we want Kevin Faulkner to be the mayoral candidate. Carl, you're too divisive. You belong in Congress. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly what's wrong with Congress. We have enough of that. And sending a Tea Party extremist to fix the problem with Tea Party extremism is not the way to move forward.
Are you a Tea Party?
Where do I even start to unpack that? First and foremost, the Tea Party did not support me in the primary for this congressional seat. They put in a right-wing candidate, and they backed that right-wing candidate to the hilt. Why? Because I have a history, I have a record of taking on my own political party and challenging them to change. I'm taking on the right wing on social issues. I don't believe that social issues should be part of Congress's agenda. I think that we should allow people to make decisions on social issues in the context of their own faith, their own family, their own personal beliefs, first. Second, when you talk about the accomplishments that we had at City Hall, everyone in San Diego saw that when Mr. Peters left City Council in 2008, the city was on the brink of bankruptcy. Billions of dollars in debt, hundreds of millions of dollars in shortfalls in the budget. The city was paying out lavish pensions to government employees that we could not afford. Mr. Peters talks about an extreme budget. He voted to eliminate daycare programs for needy families. He voted to cut library hours by 42%. He voted to undermine police and fire services. He eliminated the only fire rescue helicopter 3 months before a major catastrophic fire. So my budget plan has always been, how do we make government work again? How do we restore services? And Scott, the very clear fact basis that all San Diegans know is that in 4 years' time, I cleaned up the mess that you created over 8 years. And we did that by bringing people together. Bipartisan vote after bipartisan vote on the city council. And then, of course, the ultimate bipartisan vote in the city, the pension reform initiative in 2012 that brought Democrats, independents, and Republicans together from around the city. It carried every single council district, every socioeconomic group. Why? Because we built a solution-oriented agenda to fix our city. Mr. Peters, however, opposed those reforms every step of the way. I would consider that pretty extreme.
I think I need to address that more.
Yes,
that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
I was not on the city of San Diego had a couple decades of bad financial practices before I got on there. And I wasn't on the city council that started pension underfunding, but I was on the city council that ended it. And we worked for many years on reforms before Mr. DeMaio got there. And Mayor Sanders called me his partner in meaningful pension reform. At the end of our work, the SEC, which enforces the security laws, said that San Diego was a model for other cities to follow. And even Mr. DeMaio, when we negotiated a new pension system in 2008 that would save the city for about $22 million a year in pension payments, Mr. DeMaio came to our press conference to congratulate us on the work. So to say that nothing was done when he was there is really disingenuous. I'd also say, too, we had a lot of issues with the bubble bursting in the internet, and we had to deal with a lot of tough budget issues. And we did it as a bipartisan group. We also, we worked with the mayor, with a Republican mayor, with Democrats on the council, came up with budgets every year that I supported. And they weren't always great. Some of them had tough choices in them. But I was proud to be part of a solution-oriented, consensus-building group, which is a problem-solving approach we need in Congress. What Mr. DeMaio was doing was voting against every single budget and then claiming credit for what was in there.
We're on the clock here, less than 2 minutes.
I understand. Look, Mr. Peters handed off in 2008 a city that was on the brink of bankruptcy. All the media accounts at the time confirmed that. The city's roads were falling apart. The city's services were at historically low levels in terms of library hours and police and fire coverage. Mr. Peters, after cutting all those services, gave politicians a 42% salary hike in the middle of one of our worst budget crises. He took $69,000 in auto allowances for his new BMW. This is the sort of leadership that he gave us on city council. Now, in 4 years' time, what did we do? We balanced the budget. We did it without accounting gimmicks. We reformed the pension system. We put an end to the six-figure pension payouts. We were able to actually make San Diego a model that is cited around the country through my pension reform program, and more importantly than anything else, and this is what I'm really passionate about, we actually started restoring the services that Mr. Peters cut. Library hours, road repairs, getting our city moving again in ways that we hadn't seen in nearly a decade. I'm proud of that. It took Democrats and Republicans working together, and no amount of distortions, Mr. Peters, can change that reality and those facts.
Park it here for a moment. Thank you, gentlemen.
Hold that thought. We're just getting started here. Well done so far. And as we head to this break, we wanted to pass along an item in the nature of full disclosure. While doing research for this particular debate, we learned that Comcast, the company that owns NBC7, has a political action committee that has donated to congressional candidates around the country, including $2,000 to Mr. Peters, the incumbent Democrat. Interestingly, that political action committee donated $8,000 to Mr. Peters' incumbent Republican predecessor, Brian Bilbray, during the last election cycle. That committee's actions have no bearing on what we do here at NBC7 or in any of the questions tonight, but we wanted to be as open as possible. We'll continue our conversation with the candidates right after this.
And now, an NBC7 News special, a conversation with the candidates.
Welcome back to a special edition of NBC7 News at 6 o'clock. I'm Mark Mullen, along with Catherine Garcia and Jean Covesit. We're hosting a conversation with the candidates at the District 52 congressional seat. The two candidates facing off in the November election are incumbent Congressman Scott Peters and former City Councilman Carl DeMaio.
So before we get back to some questions, we thought we'd give you, our viewers, some background about the candidates. Here's a look at both resumes. Scott Peters earned his undergraduate degree from Duke University and attended New York University School of Law. He was an environmental lawyer before going into politics. Peters served on the San Diego City Council from 2000 to 2008. He became the first council president after the switch to a strong mayor form of government. Peters lost his bid for the city attorney's office in 2008 and was termed out of office as a councilman the same year. In 2009, he became a commissioner of the San Diego Unified Port District. In 2012, he successfully challenged Republican Brian Bilbray for the 52nd congressional district. He lives with his wife in La Jolla. They have a son and daughter.
Carl DeMaio attended Georgetown University, where he earned a degree in international business and politics. Before running for office, DeMaio started the Performance Institute, a for-profit think tank that provides training for government officials, and later founded the American Strategic Management Institute, which offered financial and management training to corporations, both companies he later sold for millions, where he began speaking publicly and backing efforts aimed at city government reform. In 2008, he ran and won a seat on the San Diego City Council, representing District 5 as an openly gay man and a self-described government watchdog, later backing Proposition B, which put before voters a plan aimed at drastically retooling city workers' retirement benefits, along with changing the cost to taxpayers. After one council term, Carl DeMaio ran for mayor, advancing to the runoff before losing to Bob Filner. DeMaio's partner is Jonathan Hale, the owner of a San Diego-based marketing firm targeting the LGBT community.
One thing both candidates have in common is they think that we left off at the break in our conversation with a couple loose ends they wanted to clear up. So we're going to give them both 20 seconds to wrap up that, and then we want to move on and talk about a couple more things. Let's start with you, Mr. Peters.
Just on the car allowance, which is, I guess, Mr. DeMaio's idea that we should be talking about issues. Everyone got the same car allowance. It was part of the compensation package that existed when I came into the council. I was the first council member to turn it back, but everyone got the same amount. The only person now taking a car allowance in the 52nd District is Lori Zapp, who supported Mr. DeMaio in his TV commercials. I don't understand that he's ever asked her to stop taking it, or that he made any effort as a city council member to get it out of the compensation package. Finally, I'd say that Mr. DeMaio made millions of dollars himself off government contracts, boasted once that he was a man of means who drove a BMW. I guess by his logic, you could say that the taxpayers bought him a BMW, but I think it's ridiculous.
About 20 seconds,
I think it has nothing to do with creating a job, educating a kid, or growing the economy.
Look, cutting Congress's perks, cutting politicians' perks is never ridiculous. You ought to lead by example. You ought to be ashamed that you're worth $100 million, but you took $69,000 worth of auto allowance payments from taxpayer, and this is years while you're cutting services to our kids in terms of after-school programs. In terms of the issue I wanted to respond to is this false attack about the Tea Party. You saw the package from NBC. Gay, socially moderate, focusing on government reform, speaking truth to power, including taking on my own political party, making government work. That is not a Tea Party agenda. That's an agenda of trying to fix broken government and actually standing up to extremists in my own party and saying, look, cut out the social issues. Let's focus on job creation and fiscal reform. That's been my life's work, and Mr. Peters, no amount of distortion can change that.
Well, let me ask you this. That was kind of interesting. I was kind of struck by your remarks on the day that you announced for Congress last September, and you had some very harsh statements about the Republican Party. One of your quotes was tarnished brand, but now it seems they're touting you as someone who can remake the image of the party, and you at one point have touted yourself as being someone in the mold of Senator Ted Cruz. So how's that all going to shake out here?
Actually, that also is not true. This is what Mr. Peters has claimed. That's not true at all. What I have said is people can make a difference even if there's one person, and that can be a good difference or it can be a destructive difference. And that was the context of the speech, which Mr. Peters once again took completely out of context, and the full video is on the internet.
Okay.
But let me talk about the
so destructive difference would be Senator Cruz. You're attributing this to him.
If you have individuals who will stand out there in the public square, light their hair on fire, and not actually move the ball forward, I don't see how that moves the needle and actually solves problems. I'm willing to take on both the establishment Republicans who think there's nothing wrong with wasteful spending, nothing wrong with corporate welfare, and certainly nothing wrong with giving politicians, including themselves, perks.
And that
I'm also willing to take on Tea Party Republicans who have a social agenda that I don't believe fits the future of our country, who also would rather stand there and say we have to get everything done overnight or everyone else is somehow suspect. Yeah. I think that we ought to have a focus on what I talked about that day, Gene, when I announced and what I've talked about throughout this entire campaign. My life's work has been offering positive solutions and trying to build consensus. I don't care whether it's a Democrat, Republican, or independent.
Sir, is that if you are so busy taking on everybody and speaking truth to power, I think a lot of constituents, a lot of voters would want to know whether you're going to go to Washington if elected and fight with everybody, or if you really can get things done.
And I would point to the 4 years I was on the city council, where we took on the idea of a sales tax that Mr. Peters backed, and some members of the Republican Party. And San Diegans overwhelmingly stood with me to reject that tax increase in the middle of a recession. We took on the pension system, where government unions and several Republicans tried saying we don't need pension reform. I took that on. So I'm pointing to a record of helping save the city from bankruptcy, and that means you need members of Congress, members of the city council, who are not worried about pleasing the special interests, but they're worried about making sure we provide quality services to taxpayers.
Well, let us hear from a member of Congress now.
Mark, your question hit the nail on the head. And the fact is, you know, the Tea Party, the frustrated establishment Republicans are frustrated with the Tea Party. The Tea Party talks back to the Republicans too. It says, shut down the government. It says, don't pay our debts. It says, get our credit downgraded, because they don't seem to have any duty to come together and reach an agreement. And that's the mold that Mr. DeMaio has followed, both in his own words, by who supports him, and also in his history at the city. You're right, he fought with everybody. And no one would say that Mr. DeMaio is not a fighter, even people who like him. But the problem is we have too much of that in Washington, D.C. today. And what we need is people who are willing to have the courage to go to the center of the room and to shake hands. And you know, I was proud to be unanimously elected as the city council president. It was a sign that my colleagues trusted me, Republican and Democrat. You know, Mr. DeMaio is the only member of the city council, the only member, who wasn't, his city council or the one before it, my city council, who wasn't trusted by his colleagues with even a committee chairmanship, because they didn't see him as someone who could work with other people. And that's what we got to avoid in Congress. We can't cure the problems in Congress, the divisiveness, by sending another Tea Party extremist. And that's been Mr. DeMaio's history.
Take a look at the problems we cured in San Diego. We balanced a budget. We restored services that Mr. Peters had cut. We eliminated the politician pensions and perks that they were giving themselves. We stopped the downtown redevelopment shell game, where they were taking our money from the general fund and putting it in the pockets of developers. We stopped the largest tax increase in the history of San Diego that Mr. Peters was backing. Take a look at the list of accomplishments that we were able to get done in 4 years. That's a positive record. San Diegans today benefit from the fact that we fixed the financial crisis. I'm proud of that work. It took Democrats and Republicans
Mr. DeMaio,
coming together.
I'm going to respectfully cut you off there, because I think that although people certainly care about what you both did in the city, they also want to know what you're going to do for us in Congress. One of the things that you've said quite often, even in this discussion, is that you think we should leave social issues out of our politics. That being said, you're going to have to deal with a lot of these social issues if you are elected to Congress. You both are telling us that you're moderate on a lot of these issues. Where do you disagree, so that the voters know if you do on social issues? Or can we just write that off as, yep, they both agree on?
Well, I think it gets back to Gene's question. When I announced for Congress, and this is how I dealt with these issues throughout my time on city council, I said that we ought to trust individuals to make decisions for themselves.
But we're going to trust you to make decisions if you represent us, so we have to know how you would vote on
And that means going to Washington and standing up to some of the more right-wing members of the party and saying, look, I respect your faith beliefs even if I don't necessarily agree with them. But this is not the place. Government and Congress will not be the place to impose your moral views on the rest of us. And that's why I will oppose any attempts to put social issues or a social agenda at the forefront of Congress's priorities.
You know, I'm proud to be endorsed by Pro-Choice America, by Planned Parenthood, and I have a long-standing track record of standing up for women, women's reproductive freedom and their economic security. The thing about Mr. DeMaio is you're right, you didn't get an answer to your question. He won't fill out the form that Planned Parenthood puts out to see where he really is on these issues. And you know, Planned Parenthood is an organization that endorsed Republicans like Jerry Sanders, like Greg Cox, like Ron Roberts, who filled out this questionnaire. They make it public. You're welcome to see mine. You know, I have a 100% record on standing up for women's reproductive freedom. I've been an advocate for equal pay for equal work. We didn't hear Mr. DeMaio take any stand on any of those women's workplace equity issues until a press conference 2 weeks ago, and he didn't mention the Paycheck Fairness Act, which I've been championing for almost 2 years since I got into Congress. Again, he could ask Mr. Boehner, who's raising money for him and supporting him, to let us have a vote on that, but we don't know that he's done that. We don't even know from his own mouth whether he would support the Paycheck Fairness Act. So look, I like him saying that he's a moderate, but it's more than labels. You have to say what you'd be willing to do for people and for women.
This is what's wrong with our political system.
But would you be able to say whether you would support
Absolutely.
equal pay? Yeah.
Absolutely. I've already said that very clearly. I've said that months ago. But this is what's wrong with our political system. Democrats want to use social issues and keep them alive, and far-right Republicans want to use social issues and keep them alive. To constantly battle on issues that should have nothing to do with what happens in Congress. We should allow individuals to decide these issues. We should err on the side of personal freedom.
What do you say to
pro-choice,
disenfranchised, though, who may look to the government for some sort of help?
I absolutely believe that our civil rights laws ought to defend full equality for all individuals. We should treat everyone with respect. And I'm a change agent in the Republican Party. Gene, you said that we're getting a lot of attention in my candidacy as perhaps someone who can break the mold of an old, and this is to quote the UT editorial, someone who can challenge the intolerant, inflexible views of the Republican Party and say, look, this is the 21st century. Let's trust people. If we're willing to trust people with their tax dollars through lower taxes, if we're willing to trust the free market to solve problems faster than government mandates, can we trust people to love who they want to love? Can we trust people to make decisions for their health? These are issues that we should settle on the score of equality, respect, and non-discrimination. I will be a voice in the Republican Party to change those issues nationally, and it'll have a great impact.
Let's let Mr. Peters weigh in now.
Well, unfortunately, when he had a chance to really be a voice, he wasn't on this issue. I've supported marriage equality. We used to call it same-sex marriage back in 2000 when I was first running for office. Mr. DeMaio was elected in 2008 in June because he won the primary. And the next thing up was Proposition 8. And they asked him, which was to ban marriage equality. And they asked him, won't you please, as a Republican, be a change agent? Won't you stand up and say this is the wrong thing to do? And he told his own community, no, we won't do it. And so that's why when at the Pride Parade you saw Mr. DeMaio get booed. And he won't go anymore because he can't stand the treatment, because he feels like the community feels that he turned their back on them and that he didn't stand up. So I think these words are hollow. I think what we see is someone who's running for office and says what's now popular, but has no history of really being the change agent that he purports to be today.
Are you being ambiguous?
I think I've always been clear about my orientation, if that's what you're referring to. Well, on the issues, I have always been a believer in personal freedom. I have not reserved any sort of support for those issues. And in fact, I have a 100% LGBT voting record on the City Council. My voting record is the same as Todd Gloria's on social issues on the City Council. I led the charge to get the city on the record against Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which allowed gay service members to serve openly, with dignity, without any fear of retaliation. I also supported the Equal Benefits Ordinance that said we should be treating people equally, whether they're married or domestic partners. But Mr. Peters wants to use and misrepresent my positions. He wants to divide us, and that's what's wrong in Washington. They look at these social issues as issues to excite the base. And you know what it distracts us from? Getting people back to work, creating middle-class jobs, balancing the budget, dealing with the national debt, and holding government accountable for like veterans programs. We got to get off these divisive social issues. I'm willing to do my part, Scott, by challenging the Republican Party to change. But you have shown in this debate that you are willing to deceive San Diegans and distort my record. And I think it's a shame.
There's been no distortion in the record. It's been quite clear. But I'd be happy to move on to some federal issues.
Let's talk about health care for just a moment.
A divisive issue.
That we should probably address, though. With national health care, with the so-called Obamacare, same question for both of you all. Repeal it, replace it or fix it?
Well, I'm a fix-it guy, and I wasn't in Congress when they passed the Affordable Care Act, but we can't go back to where we were before. People getting their health care from emergency rooms, which costs us money. People not having enough money to pay their medical bills. It was the largest cause of personal bankruptcies. Costs spiraling out of control. Insurance companies able to deny your coverage because you had a pre-existing condition. We had to move beyond that, and so I think that this has been progress. Now, I would say that there's a lot left to do, and one of the areas where I've distinguished myself as independent is I've been willing to take votes, frankly, with the other party to fix this law. I voted to let you keep your plan if you like it. I voted to give individuals the same extension of compliance time as businesses got. I think when we saw the rollout and how that was kind of botched, that was a good vote. And I've shown again and again that I'm willing to work on it to make it better, but I don't support repealing it. I think we can't go back. We have to move forward.
Mr. DeMaio.
Look, healthcare was in a crisis state before Obamacare. Obamacare, I think, is the wrong direction. I think it adds to the problems. Neither party has offered a solution to provide for accessible, affordable, quality health care where people, individuals, get to make decisions with their doctors. Not some health insurance company getting in the way, not some government bureaucrat getting in the way telling us what's good for us. And so I support a different approach to the health care reform debate. I hope that we can get past the labels of Obamacare, Republican or Democrat, and just say, can we support common sense health care reforms that bend the cost curve to make health care more affordable? There are some things I would keep about Obamacare. First, I would keep the elimination of the pre-existing condition penalty. I've never understood why that was in place. I think it's a very punitive policy that health insurance companies use to limit access to care. Second, I would allow children in college to continue on their parents' insurance if they so chose to. I would also keep health care exchanges, but I would not have government manage a website or manage the exchanges. I would allow the market to handle that because the healthcare exchanges allow us to diversify the risk pool, allow us to get bulk purchasing power. I would go even further. I would allow people to redeem their employer health plan on the exchange to get a better plan or a plan that actually allows them to keep their doctor. I would allow competition across state lines. I would also reverse the $700 billion in cuts that Mr. Peters supported as part of Obamacare to Medicare, and that threatens the health care security of seniors. And most importantly, above everything else, just to lead by example, I would strip members of Congress from those, of those special health care subsidies that they put in the Obamacare law, because you know what? If a law is good enough for you and I to comply with, why in the world shouldn't members of Congress be expected to live under the same law?
Mr. Peters.
I think that the implication is that Mr. DeMaio would vote to repeal it, but I didn't hear that. The $700 million was an attack the last campaign had against me. Wasn't even here when Obamacare was, or the Affordable Care Act was adopted, and so I think that attack is misplaced. Let me do say this about the health care, because he raised this issue of perks. You should know that I've led by example. I've turned down my congressional pension. I've turned down the congressional health care. When the Tea Party sequester went into effect and there were 8% across the board cuts, I led by example and cut my own pay 8%, donated it back to charity. And when the Tea Party shut down the government because they wanted to repeal the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, I turned my whole salary over to charities here in San Diego for veterans and seniors who are affected by those cuts. So what I don't want to hear is that I'm not attuned to what these perks are. The other thing I would say, just that Mr. DeMaio will tell you that I take a city pension. It's about $20,000 a year. What he won't tell you is that I've given every dime of it back to city libraries. I'm proud to do so.
Let's talk about perks, Gene, because this is an important issue, and it's about leading by example. It's about, will our elected officials put themselves under the same rules as the rest of us? Mr. Peters, and this is important.
Let me ask you about an overarching issue here, which is actually pretty crucial here in the western states, especially California. We've got a drought going on. What specific plans, ideas, legislative initiatives do you or Congressman you have for dealing with, especially since there are concerns about whether San Diego is going to get another waiver from the Clean Water Act to keep discharging sewage into the ocean to the extent that it is treated and to the extent that we've done it for a number of years? And what about funding for San Diego's Pure Water program? Do you see a linkage there? Is there anything that you have that you think that you can get through Congress and the White House?
Well, I would be happy to talk about water, but this is important because Mr. Peters just sat here. He's worth $100 million, and there's nothing wrong with that, Scott. Congratulations. He's the 8th richest member of Congress. But this is a man who, on the city council, while he was worth this amount, he voted to increase his own salary. He took this big auto allowance. He enrolled in the pension program. And he took his pension early. This is very important. He also voted in Congress to protect the perks of members of Congress. He allowed them to get paid even though they shut down the government. So I need to correct the record before we move to water because this is very important.
Well,
as it relates to water, I think that it is also a lead by an example issue.
I think if you could do it quickly, please, because we've got some other stuff we want to get to.
I'd like to be able to
Mr.
respond.
Peters is in Congress now. Do you have something that you can do that's immediate here in terms of
the water issue in San Diego is about investing in infrastructure, in making sure that we have a water rate structure here in San Diego that allows us to save money. Now, Mr. Peters had a federal law called the Clean Water Act. He voted to not follow the Clean Water Act in setting water rates in San Diego on residents so he could subsidize businesses. We won't save water until we change the water rate structure.
Mr. Peters, we're on the clock.
Sure. Well, I'd like a little bit of time to address what I think is really one of the fundamental issues that the localities, the state, and the federal government have to be in partnership on. We are very fortunate that San Diego has taken a lead in taking care of its own water supply. When I was on the council, we did a deal with the farmers in the Imperial County to bring water in so we weren't dependent for imported water only on the north. We also invested in storage at a local level. I supported desalination, which was a very controversial thing both when I was at the City Council and on the Coastal Commission. We have to diversify our water supply. The other thing we supported locally was the pure water thing, which people demonize as toilet to tap, but we need to recycle our water. Mr. DeMaio was a consistent opponent of that. But we can't be sending what's treatable water outfall 4 miles into the ocean. We have to take care of that resource right here. What I will do with the federal government is just what you said. You know, we've gone from being behind the curve in San Diego, always asking for permission to discharge waste that's not treated to the level of other places. We always made a scientific justification for it. We didn't want to impose the costs on ratepayers. But today, using this pure water system, this water recycling, we can be the leader in the nation. And we can show how to do recycling, take care of our own resource, do it right here. That needs the permission of the federal government. The federal government also needs to be a partner in building infrastructure, and we hope that folks will support the state water bond, which is also a critical component of this as well.
I want to ask you a question that I think maybe speak to more of a big picture how you would look at having this job in Congress. Representative Jackie Speier of California has asked the House Oversight Committee to hold a hearing on the Ray Rice domestic abuse incident and basically into how the NFL handled it. Also, 3 Democratic senators have introduced a measure to eliminate the NFL's tax protection if it continues to support the Washington team's name, the Redskins. I'm wondering if you as a congressman, if you were in Congress, would you support having a hearing like this, and would you support that sort of legislation?
Well, I think the Rice case is just deplorable. Women should not be treated that way, and we have role models, and we should hold them to a higher standard. So my hope is that the NFL can clean up its mess.
But would you hold hearings on it?
I think that hearings are important because it's part of raising the consciousness. It's part of raising this issue. And if we aren't satisfied that they've dealt with these issues, then Congress has a number of levers that it can use to push the issues along, if you will. But at this point, I want to see what the NFL does. I think the message has been sent loud and clear. As it relates to the Redskins name, I don't support that name. I think it is offensive to many of our Native Americans. We have, in San Diego County, 19 tribes.
And you'd support the legislation?
I think that my hope is that the team ownership will see that this is not a good economic decision for them, but if necessary, I think that the Congress can take action on this.
Mr. Peters.
I would just say, you know, we should recognize that domestic violence is a problem that extends far beyond the NFL. And the interest that Congress has in it is beyond whether it's in a football league. In fact, we've been dealing with this, and Jackie Speier has been a leader in the military. And we play a very important role in Congress in facilitating a national conversation about these things. We have to shine light on this in Congress. So the idea of having hearings, I don't want you to think we're so much about regulating the NFL, but we have to have a discussion about domestic violence in this country. And I think that it's important for Congress to participate in that and to play a role.
So we're just about out of time. We'd love to give both of you all 1 minute just to give some final thoughts, or 30 seconds rather. We're that short on time. You first, please.
Well, in this campaign, you're going to see a lot of these nasty attack ads, and I think San Diegans deserve better. In the 4 years I was on the city council, we were able to save a city from the brink of bankruptcy. And the measurement I always used was not just balancing a budget, it was restoring important services to our communities. In Washington, we have to tackle the fiscal crisis. We have to get the middle class jobs back in this country so the American dream is restored. And we have to hold government accountable to get results in key areas like veterans benefits and the border. I'm a proven reformer. No amount of name calling from Mr. Peters.
We're out of time, sir.
I would just say that when I was elected in 2012, I promised to bring a problem-solving approach to Congress to get beyond this Tea Party divisiveness. And we've made tremendous strides. We have our first budget in Congress in 3 years. The local delegation, Darrell Issa said, we have a group of 5 people finally who like each other and can work together. We need to continue to extend that ethic throughout Congress. And if the 52nd District voters are willing to do so, I'd be happy to go back and continue to fight to make it better.
Seems like a good place to end it. Our special thanks to the 2 candidates for sharing their views and time tonight, Republican Carl DeMaio and Democratic Congressman Scott Peters. The 52nd District is an important district to not only us, but the entire country, the entire nation now watching to see which one of these 2 men will represent so many of you in Congress.
Yeah, we hope tonight that you were able to get a better sense of who they are and what they stand for and how they would work for our community. So, don't forget, the election is November 4th. A lot of you will be voting by mail before then. We hope you were able to help get some information to help you make a choice. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again, of course, for the news tonight at 11 o'clock.
Have a good night. All right, gentlemen.